Nick, welcome to the stage. Hello, hello. You are on mute. I think
Hello.
that's good.
There we go.
Okay, you've got me here. For some reason, our deck is not loading. So long story short, we'll just get right to today's conversation. How's it going?
Great.
Where are you joining from?
I'm joining from my basement just north of Seattle. This is my new home office, so it's got very rustic features to it, and I'm super excited to be here.
I'm digging the flowers in the background. I love figuring out where everybody's joining from in weird remote world because everybody's figured out some way to hide from their kids.
That's exactly right. I mean, my kids actually talk to me through my vent, which is located here, so they like to shout down to me. So apologies to anybody in the audience that hears children trying to tell me about what they're building upstairs or what they might be eating.
All right, fair enough. Well, you've got your LaCroix in hand. I think we're ready to start today's conversation. I think the best way to start today's talk would be, let's establish what the tech scene looked like in Seattle pre-pandemic. And then we can talk a little bit about how that compared to San Francisco. So set the stage for us. Let's say it's February 10th, 2020. It's a few weeks before the entire world is about to implode. What does it look like there in the tech scene?
Yeah, I mean, the tech scene here, well, I would expect most of the folks on this call are fairly familiar with the tech scene up here. There's a lot of crossover between Seattle and San Francisco. We have a really thriving tech scene up here. Everybody knows that we have some of the large folks here. Microsoft founded not in Seattle, but just outside of Seattle. Amazon has its corporate headquarters here, which I want to stress this point as we go through the conversation, that Amazon has a very outsized presence here. There are roughly 55,000 workers that descend into Seattle almost, or pre-pandemic, they were descending into Seattle every day. And at points, Amazon has taken up roughly 20 to 25% of leasable office space. So, I mean, their footprint here is massive. And so I just want to put this in as like a beginning caveat that their presence here is really, really significant. So, but I would say, you know, beyond Amazon, like there is a lot of tech activity going on here. There's a lot of mid-sized companies located all throughout the area. Many of your folks from down in the Bay Area have significant outposts up here. So we've got a large outpost for Facebook, a large outpost for Google, a large outpost for Salesforce, Apple spinning up an outpost. So there's lots of activity, and a lot of that activity, at least in Seattle, is really centered in one neighborhood, or mostly one neighborhood, called South Lake Union. And South Lake Union is sort of on the north end of downtown. And historically, South Lake Union, actually, I'm gonna dive into some of the history of South Lake Union really quickly. Sorry, right. Like this is a really rambly introduction, but I'm just gonna go with it. Is that okay?
No, we are wonking out today. There is
cool.
People joining in to hear, like, they want the real story. Let's hear it.
Okay, cool. So the real story of South Lake Union is, so back in the 90s, Seattle was seeing a revitalization of the downtown area, like many downtowns were. And Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft, passed away a couple of years ago, had bought up a very significant portion of South Lake Union. And so he was buying up like these big chunks of land that historically were very unwanted. They were manufacturing areas and the like. And he, you know, in a lot of ways, Paul Allen was a great civic visionary. I mean, he had a lot of interest in seeing Seattle thrive. And his plan for this land was actually to build what he called the Seattle Commons. And the Seattle Commons was going to be a ginormous park that would basically rival Central Park in New York. And it went to the voters a couple of times because there needed to be public dollars invested for him to put up the land. in true Seattle fashion, basically anything that gets touched by a billionaire around here, voters generally don't like it. So it got voted down not once, but twice. And so Paul Allen took his land and created a new vision. And that new vision was going to be really an epicenter for tech and life sciences. And that is what we have today, is we have a epicenter within the city that is really focused on tech and life sciences. And now it's this beautiful, thriving area with lots of different tech companies, most of which is Amazon right in that area. So, so coming back to your main question, you know, we were a bustling city, right? Like any other urban area, lots of activity going on over the course of the day, and that's the gist of it.
I love your comment about how just like any billionaire touches it. Obviously, we've had a really similar revitalization that happened in the South of Market in San Francisco. So our big coming out party actually for SF.citi was, we were created back in 2012 when they were trying to revitalize our mid-market. So we had a ton of like abandoned buildings, and they created what was known as the mid-market tax break, which will go down, I think, in infamy as one of the most loved and hated tax policies in San Francisco, at least in the last few decades. And I think the jury's still out on whether that worked as intended. So what is the Seattle Commons idea? What does it look like today? How did it evolve? Did it become exactly what it was supposed to be intended, or just?
No, I mean, well, now it's not called the Seattle Commons. The Seattle Commons was going to be the name of the park. And instead we've ended up with a much smaller public space down at the area of South Lake Union. And it's got, you know, like Google built a new building right next to it, and it's got a beautiful view of the lake and a beautiful view of the park there. But really it turned into, as opposed to this great public space, a space for life sciences and tech.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to move to today. So it has been almost a year of work from home for us, certainly. So the remote work shift happened at the very beginning of March for San Francisco. I think Seattle was a few weeks after, right? You guys were number 2 in the country.
Yeah, we definitely, you know, we definitely had city folks and school folks starting to shut down things early. And I think everybody knows this, but one of the first COVID cases was here. First COVID death was here. So the city and schools reacted sort of swiftly. Tech definitely reacted fast. I mean, everybody we were talking to was watching very, very closely. At that time, we had a couple hundred kids that we were going to bring from Seattle Public Schools into tech companies. Ended up having to cancel a little bit because of COVID, which was really unfortunate, but definitely the safe thing to do.
So I'm going to just add a little side note. Have you reopened your schools yet?
No.
Okay. You guys are in the same boat as us. This is an entire separate conversation we could have, but this is, at this point, our city is now suing the school board for not having a proper plan to reopen our schools. So you guys are seeing a really similar dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, our schools are looking at getting K2 back into the buildings, and I think that's scheduled to go mid to late March right now. You know, there's a lot of pressure from the community to make sure that there's that those upper grades are also getting back in. But you know, kind of between the conversations with the teachers union and trying to make sure that everything stays safe, like it's a real mess. It's tough. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that'll be an entire other 60-minute conversation. But to get back on track so we now in San Francisco have seen a crazy change downtown in terms of the office space and the activity. It dropped down to less than 5% occupied when it was more than 90% occupied space on any given basis, right? So we at this point have the equivalent of more than 10 Salesforce towers of empty real estate. It is just absolutely wild how much real estate, office real estate in particular, has dropped in this city. We had less than a 3% vacancy rate this time a year ago. And now we have as of right now, 14 million square feet available. Are you guys seeing similar empty buildings? Were your buildings in a little bit of a different vacancy rate before things went in, or same situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, like the experience of it is very similar, right? So if you go downtown, it's not it's not as bad as it was last May when I went down to our office to check our mail, right? But
Yeah.
it it it's pretty quiet downtown these days. There's not a lot of activity going on. We know that the local restaurant scene, like San Francisco, is just taking a huge hit because there's not any workers coming into downtown.
Yeah.
Um, I think the thing that's interesting for us though is that, well, there's a couple of different factors here. One, we've been building like crazy for the last 10 years. I mean, so when you look at the Seattle skyline, like it is really easy to count 20, 30 some odd cranes operating. And it's
Yeah.
been that way for like 10 years. So the skyline has been dramatically changed, and even now is continuing to be built. So I think that that's one really interesting factor. Another really interesting factor is, we aren't seeing companies actually give up their leases yet, right? Like we aren't seeing the complete vacating of space. Um, we're folks are implementing work from home policies. One that I think is really notable is Zillow. So Zillow occupies a
Hmm.
number of floors of a large building in downtown, and historically Zillow has been one of the companies that I would say like they are an in-person company, and I think it kind of comes from their real estate roots, right? Like
Yeah. It's very old
face-to-face
school.
face-to-face transactions, like face-to-face work, and um, and they last summer completely reversed course and said, I mean, last July they came out and said, hey, we're going to go completely work from home, or 90% work from home. And so you have these companies that are holding on to space right now that are trying to figure out, like, hey, how do we rework the space? How much space do we actually need for implementing hybrid models, right? But we aren't seeing sort of this, the same, like, hey, we're fleeing the space, we're subletting it, we're getting rid of it. Not the same way that you guys are down in San Francisco, as far as I understand it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very timely conversation because less than 24 hours ago, the largest private employer in San Francisco, Salesforce, announced that they were going remote first, right? And it's interesting because remote first and permanently remote are two different things, right? So many folks were really concerned that there's two ways that you exist. You either exist in the office 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, or you exist completely floating around in the cloud and don't have any office footprint whatsoever. But we've seen over the last 8 or 9 months that that's just not the reality for most tech companies. Most tech companies need to exist somewhere in the middle. I would say in terms of the larger companies, the somewhere in the middle is definitely going to be where we see most of them go. Smaller, if you're lean and nimble and you've got the ability to go fully in the cloud, that's a different story. The small and medium-sized tech companies that we've spoken to, we've had one founder told us we were 10% remote before the pandemic hit. We're 90% remote now. So if you have that ability and you're not holding on to that office space, then you definitely can just kind of cut the cord. But I think it'll be interesting to see in these next few years, all of these larger tech companies that have decided to move to the hybrid model, are they going to just move to one model or the other, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this conversation, I think, is worthy of very thorough examination, because
Yeah.
this type of hybrid model has, in my opinion, far greater potential to shape and shift how cities think about infrastructure, how they think about community, how they think about all the different components, sort of where they cite business. I mean, it bleeds into like zoning models, right? Like, I
Of
mean,
course it does.
it's super complex, and and we are just like, we're just at the beginning of it,
I
just
know.
at the beginning, right? Like
It's the
everybody's like,
precipice.
yeah, like, hey, we're going to do something hybrid. Like, well, what exactly does that mean? So all of a sudden you're going to have like a WeWork style team that's optimizing your space so you can shrink your footprint. And how do you inculcate, like bring culture into these hybrid teams? So
Yeah.
I think it's
It's
super fascinating.
and it's also fascinating because if you consider this hybrid remote setting to be how you go back, but then you also are moving towards either the hub and spoke or the decentralized model, those two together, that's I think where we have the most serious impact on your Seattles and San Franciscos, because
Yes.
we have HQs, right? We have big offices. San Francisco has a number of headquarters, a big one being Salesforce, as we mentioned, right? So in the initialized capital report, for instance, 3/4 of all founders they spoke to were moving away from having an HQ. 3/4. And so it begs the question, if we continue to see some of these large mainstays that had HQs in the past shifting potentially around in the next few years, while all the new upstarts never have an HQ to begin with, what do we look like 5, 10 years down the road?
Right. Exactly. And that conversation, as far as I'm aware, is like, that is not a present conversation.
No, absolutely not. So tech is also growing in Seattle, right? So San Francisco, we don't have really great data around job growth, but there was a number of different studies that have cited that San Francisco's down to the degree that it's down. There was one study a few months ago that said that it had the biggest drop of any city for job postings anywhere in the country. But I've seen from most recent LinkedIn data that you all were adding 2.2 tech jobs for every one that you lost. So what does that look like when you're adding jobs? Are these in-person roles? Are they remote right now? Where's the job growth in Seattle's tech scene?
Yeah, I mean, it's all remote right now. I mean, like
Yeah,
a couple of offices have opened up, and you've got to go in and schedule your time there.
yeah, it's
But
weird.
like, yeah, yeah. So it's interesting to hear that like Seattle job growth is happening, right? I think it's sort of, at some point people will be allowed back into the office, and likely it will be around the Seattle area.
Yeah.
So but yeah, I just think that's it's a very weird dynamic to talk about right now.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting too, when they look at these job listings, they probably have a company location listed, but then they probably say remote eligible right next to it.
Right.
So
Right.
gathering like what that actual footprint's going to look like over the next 6 months, I think is a really tricky situation.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do think I mean, again, kind of coming back to some of the main companies around here. I mean, Amazon, blockbuster growth. I mean, they added whatever 500,000 jobs in the last year, not here in Seattle, but worldwide. Microsoft is continuing to crush it. We've got a lot of B2B up here, and B2B just
Yeah.
really is in a lot of ways unaffected. Our friends over at Rover, like our friends in the B2C world, have just been pummeled, and it's
Yeah.
really sad to watch. But like B2B seems super healthy.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that it's such an interesting it's interesting because tech is this large umbrella category for so many people, but we saw with our members, on the breaking point of almost going under at some point, and then other members, we've got Slack and other folks like that where they were just skyrocketing. It
Right.
was a very, very strange few months. And then, for instance, Airbnb laid off a quarter of their workforce and then IPO'd 6 months later.
Right. Which is a fascinating case study and story in and of itself.
Yeah, that is a business school book, like an
For
entire
sure.
book you're gonna have to read, like 100%.
For sure. Yeah, we, Expedia is also in our membership, and, sort of watching Expedia is fascinating. One other thing that I didn't address sort of early on here is, as we're talking about Seattle, there's Seattle and sort of Seattle area, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and you've got similar dynamics down in the San Francisco area, where, we don't just have Seattle, but we also have Bellevue, Redmond, and Kirkland, all of whom are sort of these competing municipalities and competing cities trying to like lure in talent and lure in companies. And well, they aren't always trying to lure in companies. I'll just leave it at that for the moment. But Expedia a couple of years ago made a decision to jump over to the Seattle side. So they jump over to the Seattle side when right now what we're seeing actually a lot of people kind of move the other direction, jumping over to what we refer
Same
to
as
as
us.
the east side. Yeah, and
Yeah.
and now they're in like they were just getting people into their brand new building, and travel's not a great business to be in right now.
So, all right, let's talk about that a little bit more, because that's something that's really fascinating for us. We have so many different municipalities in the Bay Area. Same with you guys, right? And not all the tech companies that are known for being in Seattle, half of them aren't even in Seattle proper. Do you end up having do you have these like micro moves where you've got somebody that's in San Francisco or in Seattle, and then they just like move just over the bridge or something like that so that they can get a different tax situation? Because we certainly have seen that in San Francisco. We've had folks that move to South San Francisco, for instance, right? Just a few miles down south, and then all of a sudden you go from paying a gross receipts tax of tens of millions of dollars a year to less than $1 million in business registration tax to do the same work in just 10 miles south.
Absolutely, we see that. And it's hard to sort of decouple that from the political conversation, right? I mean, like it's in a lot of ways seems to be driven by politics. But you see that all the time. I think Expedia is the one that's sort of bucking the norm here, where they were over on the east side and came this direction. And it's interesting because these companies are making decisions based on sort of different criteria, right? So for talent, if they're looking to attract talent, having a spot in an urban setting is really attractive for some of the folks that they want to have on their team. If they're thinking about the political nature of the different cities, kind of pushing over to the other side of the water, over to the east side that is largely more suburban, is more attractive. And so you sort of see people kind of jockeying around, and the companies that are on the kind of mid-size to bigger range. So for instance, like Google and Facebook both have about 5,000-6,000 employees here. They both have offices here in Seattle in the South Lake Union neighborhood, as well as on the east side. So they sort of split their campuses. And you're seeing the same happen with Amazon right now. So Amazon is, like Amazon's building up over in Bellevue. I mean, they're acquiring property like crazy. They've made announcements. I think the most recent announcement puts them at about 25,000 folks over on the east side, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Wow.
So
that's huge.
Yeah. And then, there's also like this interesting dynamic where like people are also trying to figure out where they want to live, right? And so some people live on the east side because you can get like a little more rural or suburban over there, but then they're commuting into downtown, and vice versa. Some people want to live in an urban environment and and end up with a job. Salesforce has their office over in Bellevue, right? So it's these really interesting dynamics to watch how companies are choosing which municipality they want to sit in. But frankly, what I will say that Seattle City Council has generally generally they're not super excited about tech being here. They just aren't.
No.
And Bellevue City Council is greeting them with open arms. And I think it'll be really, again, this is something that got set in motion a couple of years ago, and it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out in the next 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We just have so many different things coming at us from all angles, right? You've got your regional counties that have various different ideas of how they're going to bring tech in. But then on top of that, we have the rest of the country, right? Because Seattle and San Francisco remain some of the biggest tech hubs in the country. And so we're kind of more on that top. We're at the top, and we have to defend how we're going to maintain being in that status. And increasingly, this is a conversation we're hearing a lot about, is there is other quality of life indicators that are driving people to other parts of the country. So you guys, for instance, you did see a rent drop. We've seen a crazy rent drop, right? Our rent has dropped by about a quarter. So we're closer to Manhattan prices, which just sounds like such a joke to say, like, guys, move into San Francisco. We're close to Manhattan prices now. But you guys are closer to what, 1,600 for a median one bed, something around there?
Yeah, I think it might even be like 1,300, 1,500.
13.
I mean, yeah,
Wow.
like, and there's deals to be found, so, but despite the rent drops, I mean, housing
Yeah.
here is still, like, housing is competitive. I mean, it's really competitive, and housing prices continue to go up. So if you actually want to buy around here, it's not an easy market to buy in.
Yeah. I mean, that's the same thing that's going on. We have our housing market, just in terms of buying, is holding very, very strong in San Francisco. Our rental dropping very, very quickly, but housing is definitely consistently a pretty hot market.
Yeah.
And I think that also just goes to show the difference between people that are embracing this remote work phenomenon versus those who are able to stay. I mean, certainly if you have the means to actually purchase in San Francisco, it might look very desirable right now. But if you don't have the means to do that, perhaps you're a junior level professional, I think, the mountains of Denver or the mountains of Colorado might look a little bit better.
The mountains of Idaho, right? I mean, does
Is there
Idaho
mountains
have
in Idaho?
mountains? Yeah.
I
Does
don't
it?
know.
I don't
Yeah.
think so. I mean, small
Okay.
mountains maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. So just a reminder to everybody, we can get into questions shortly. If you have a question, I can see them piling up in the Q&A if you want to drop a question in there. So what does it look like in terms of the capital that's moving into the region? Are you still seeing a lot of investment coming into Seattle, or is it starting to taper off?
Investment in which sense?
Startups, just like any of your tech investments.
Gotcha. Yep. Yeah, I still have my head around housing. I'm like, so yeah, I mean, Seattle has never been the top for VC funds. But what we do have here is we have some really great kind of homegrown VCs. One of which is Madrona. We work with them super closely. They're a fantastic VC that really prioritizes business here locally. And has been integral in helping to build and shape the tech ecosystem that exists here now. So, I mean, a lot of our companies that are around here, though, we're seeing do quite well. Rad Power Bikes just closed 150 million.
Not bad.
Yeah, that's sort of a cool, like, they're not exactly a tech company, but sort of like a tech company, I guess. And we also have a ton of really billion-dollar unicorns. We actually just got one of yours. I don't know if you know this. Do you know this? That Tanium moved up here. I mean,
I don't think I've heard of that one. You have 10 unicorns, right?
yeah, we got about 10 unicorns. So there's Convoy, Rover, Remitly, Outreach, and I mean, well, folks can just quickly Google 10 unicorns of Seattle, and you'll find them.
Yeah. All right. So you ready to go to questions?
Sure.
You want to handle them? Okay. So everybody, I'm going to quickly launch our poll just to learn a little bit more about the factors that you're interested in when moving to a city. And I can see Nick's like, all right, let me fill this out. Just get an idea of everybody's opinions here. And then we are going to go to questions. Low cost of living is winning so far. All right, let's get your thoughts in. We got some interesting questions coming in. We had a whole bunch that were submitted ahead of time. Let's see. All right, we're gonna end this poll. We've got almost half of folks voted. Isn't it fun to watch? High concentration of similar professionals. That's interesting. All right, everybody, I'm gonna give you 10 more seconds to put your information in. All right. And let's share the results out. So, low cost of living and affordable housing prices. That is what everybody is looking for in a city to live in. So that is not really boding well for San Francisco, but I guess a little bit for Seattle. How do your salaries compare?
I mean, well, right now I think you can keep your San Francisco salary and just move into Seattle. So come on up.
All right. So are you going to do like economic development for the city of Seattle?
That's my plug.
What's your pitch? Okay.
We're always looking for great
city.
talent up here. Fantastic talent, beautiful landscapes, affordable housing by San Francisco prices. I mean, housing up here is actually really interesting. It's like if you want in Seattle proper, you could like $1 million will buy a pretty decent home. I think King County median price. So anyway, I'll stop selling.
I like how $1 million can buy you a pretty decent home. That's the selling point for Seattle. I can't wait till we have this conversation with Nashville in a few weeks from now.
Oh God. Yeah, we definitely can't beat Nashville. I'm pretty sure we can't beat Austin, but we can beat San Francisco. We can beat New York. So.
All right. Fair enough. Okay. So we're going to go to our first question from Vignesh. As a tech worker at a big N company, one reason I didn't pick the SF office is how expensive rent is. One reason is that California isn't building enough high quality market rate homes. SB50, which would upzone a lot of area around transit centers, would greatly help this issue. Shouldn't we aggressively lobby for this bill and others like it? Well, Vignesh, that's $1 million question, right? We have a huge fight when it comes to both city leadership and our senators and those that are representing us in Sacramento. So we tend to, in the city of San Francisco, have very moderate pro-housing leadership that represents us up in Sacramento. And unfortunately, our Board of Supervisors continues to be more on the conservative side of housing. They would be known as probably progressives on the board, or that is what they would tout themselves as, but they're very conservative when it comes to building housing. And SB50 has been shot down, I think, twice now, potentially 3 times. It's had a few different iterations. And at this point, we really need significant lobbying support all around California, because this is a Sacramento-based bill. So it's not just San Francisco that has a say, and increasingly down in Southern California as well, especially in places like Hollywood and Beverly Hills. A lot of those areas would be rezoned for a transit hub zone. So it does affect more than just the Bay Area. And so we need a much bigger push to get that kind of housing done. Nick, do you guys have the same housing zoning fight going on?
A little bit. It's not as bad as yours. Yours is tough. I mean, when you get the state involved with it like that, I mean, that's ugly. So let's see, around affordable housing, there's actually been some significant upzones done within Seattle proper. I think it was done back in 2019, somewhere around there. And so a lot of the upzones it was across about 27 different communities in the Seattle area, really trying to kind of grow the density here. And there were some caveats that were put into it around making sure that pieces of the new projects that were coming online were held for affordable housing, right? So kind of the stuff that you would normally see. There was also some movement to increase DADUs and ADUs around here, so detached accessory dwelling units and the like. So we're seeing movements, but we suffer from some of the same stuff that you do, where we got water on 2 sides. you know,
Yep.
and there's a north boundary and a south boundary. And so you sort of only have so much to play with. You know, so affordable housing, like there's housing and then there's affordable housing, which when you talk about affordable housing, like it, like, like even that term is very relative here. I mean, affordable housing is still expensive housing.
Yeah. Well, you just tried to sell us on $1 million house, Nick.
I know. It wasn't a great pitch either.
No. Is that what you thought you'd grow up to be?
What, a real estate
I'm
agent?
kidding. Hawking $1 million homes is a discount. Could you imagine that in the 80s? How much was a Nintendo then?
Oh yeah.
I don't even know. Okay. All right. Could you elaborate? This is from Michael. Could you elaborate on Seattle City Council not being tech friendly? Now you
Oh
get the hardball question.
yeah. No, wait. Who did that come from?
That came from Michael.
Michael. Okay,
Stojkovic.
cool.
Stojkovic. I don't know.
Okay.
My Stojkovic is making me say that as Stojkovic.
Yeah, I mean, so look here. Like, I think when you're on the ground here, there's the perception. The perception is that that tech represents, not only does it represent high-paying jobs and economic growth, and it represents outsiders, is really what it's seen as.
Yep.
And so when you look at sort of the dynamics that play out in the community, what you see is you just see a lot of people that have lived here for, in some cases, generations, that are upset about tech's presence here. And so Seattle City Council, I think, similar to your board, you know, they tend really progressive. Like, I mean, we have an outright socialist on our city council, and
As do we.
so yeah, there's
We
so
got
many.
one too.
Yeah, there's so many similarities here, and you know, it's interesting because, you know, so I'll give you a specific, for example, or specific case. The Central District of the City of Seattle, historically a red line neighborhood. It was
Yep.
predominantly Black up until kind of the late 90s. And then what you started seeing was a little bit of gentrification starting to come in. And the perception is that the presence of tech here has amplified that gentrification process and pushed minority communities primarily to the south of Seattle. So, and even to the south of the county. And so a lot of our city council members, I would say, you know, they're varying shades of blue. Some are very, very, very blue. Well, I guess
As are ours.
Yeah,
it's all shades of blue.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
90+% Democrat.
Right. So there's kind of this built up community angst that they represent, and I think the policy that they push and the taxes that they push are directly targeted towards tech companies, right? I mean, our city just put in an additional ride surcharge on rides by Uber and Lyft. You know, we have the Jumpstart Seattle tax, which passed last June, which is basically it's a tax on annual salaries of greater than $150,000 for companies that have gross revenues of 7 million or more. And this is like, Jen, you'll be familiar with this. This is like the follow-up to the head tax from a couple of years ago. Yeah. And so like there's a little bit of like this palpable tension of really how it's perceived is old Seattle versus new Seattle, right? And
it's the same in San Francisco.
Yeah, and what's interesting, you know, we ran a survey of 1,600 tech workers about a year and a half ago, and in a lot of ways, like the tech community here, like they're here because they are Seattle, right? So they trend Democratic, they're sort of kind of middle-ish in that area. They care about the environment, they care about homelessness, they care about all the same things that like historical Seattle has cared about, and so it's I think that like underlying community tension sort of makes its way up into city council and bleeds out there.
Yeah, that is a very good explanation. I think the best explanation I've heard of was from our now mayor, who's a board president at the time. She said, moderates and progressives differ in one thing, and it's speed. Everybody's going the same direction, but progressives really favor going much quicker, whereas moderates want to go a lot slower. And I think that's something that, while logical and makes sense, it really gets lost in the political discourse of the kinds of mudslinging that you see in the newspapers. It's almost as if, you know, if you want to work with business or collaborate with business, they'll accuse you of all kinds of, you know, they call people Republicans, for instance. That's one of the slurs that's used in San Francisco politics. So to just give you an idea, everybody is aligned on 99% of things, but they will fight to the death over that 1%. And it sounds like Seattle is very much the same political structure.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think I'm just going to bring this up, even though there's no question related to it, because I find it really interesting.
Okay.
So, and I'm on screen right now. So, you know, our mayor Jenny Durkin, she was, she's going to be a one-term mayor, you know, and female and lesbian, right? Our superintendent did not get a new contract, Native American and lesbian, and we have a Black police chief that left her job last summer, right? And so it you know, my view is that that these folks, these women that are coming into these elected positions they're pragmatic. Like, you know, I don't like everything that they do, but they are pragmatic. And you know, and it's not, it doesn't seem to be progressive enough for the community, and so they end up kind of hitting these really, really tough walls. And so we have this like ongoing cycle of leadership changes. I mean, Seattle superintendent, we've had 8 superintendents in like 20 years, right? I mean, it's insane. And
that is insane for like
crazy.
For a school system to be able to have a robust strategy, a long-term strategy. You know, we're talking about kids that are 4 years old, or you're supposed to be figuring out what they're going to be like when they're 18.
That's right. And, you know, and I think like the pushback on Denise has been, hey, we aren't seeing enough progress for the Black community. And this was coming from parts of the Black community. And I do not want to sort of negate their experience around it. Like it's not my role to tell Black community members sort of how they should feel about things. But my perception is she did, you know, she put Black boys at the center of their strategic plan. I mean, and it's very well known that like she's gone out and talked about this really extensively. And you know, and just from like an observer standpoint, watching that sort of discourse happen, it, you know, and ultimately result in her leaving, I think what it is it's a challenge for our city. Like we need some stable leadership. So
yeah, absolutely. We have a lot of turnover too, as you can imagine. There's been a lot of movement ever since our last mayor passed. So okay, we've got a few more questions that are coming in. Actually, we have a lot of questions that are coming in. So let's try to see how many we can get through.
Okay, I'll try and be more pithy in my answers.
All right, yeah, let's get you like politician cleaned up here. Okay, what in your opinion is the top reason to move out of SF to Seattle? That's a great question from Morgan.
Best reason to move here, we have a lot of the amenities that San Francisco does. A lot of I mean, we don't get 70-degree days as often, but we have beautiful mountains nearby and your dollars go much further here.
Fair enough. Does your sky go orange?
Sometimes. Not as much as yours.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
That's a West Coast
very
problem.
Like, yeah, well, it's okay. The New York Times says it's going to be a Texas, Florida problem within the next 2 decades too. So there you go, Miami and Austin. You got something to look for. This is a great question, actually. Let's segue to, why don't larger tech companies have more branch offices in cities such as Dallas, Atlanta, Charlotte, Orlando that may not be quite as exciting as coastal cities? That way they can attract the type of workers that may not necessarily like cities like SF and Seattle, and attract more underrepresented minorities as well, and save on worker salaries. Well, that was a great question. And that is indeed one of the biggest areas of growth that you are seeing. We have seen so many companies that are starting, especially as they move towards this hub and spoke model, starting really large, full wraparound offices in places like Austin, Denver, Salt Lake City, Nashville, Miami, Atlanta. Atlanta just had a unicorn just a week ago. So I think that up until now, it's really been a battle over talent. But now that talent is increasingly looking to other forms of quality of life rather than just being on the coast, I think a lot of people have been out of their little shoebox apartment for a year now. And from most of the tech companies we're hearing, it's close to a third of their employees want to be permanently remote. So I do think that those cities have really big advantages. They also have big advantages, not just in quality of life. A lot of those have really great quality of life. Atlanta has a lot of green space. Charlotte, the Research Triangle, Miami, when it's not underwater in certain times of the year, obviously has really great outdoor space. So there's a lot of potential there. There's also a lot of potential from companies for companies to create a workforce that better represents the products that they're building. That's one of the big things that we've heard from so many founders that we've spoken to, is that when you build a product with such a homogenous workforce, especially when it's based on the coast, you can often just miss entire user experiences. And so one of the founders we spoke to said specifically, we can create better empathy for the user through building from workers that are located all around the country. So that is my answer to that. But Nick, is there anything you want to add there?
No, I think your take was great.
All right, let's go to a very let's go to a Seattle specific question. Seattle's light rail expansion across the east side is expected to be completed in a couple of years. How do you think this is going to impact Seattle's economy and people?
Yeah, I think that question directly targets what I was talking about as it relates to work from home policies and sort of how people think about their footprint within any given municipality. And I think the light rail here has been, you guys have the BART, but like we're getting the light rail 20, 30 years later.
Yeah.
So I think I see it as, ultimately I see it as a huge positive for our region. I think the question is going to be, how do each respective city councils see it? Mobility is going to continue to increase, footprints are going to go down, and I think what that ultimately leads to is, it leads to, hey, if you want to work in Seattle, apparently I'm just going to keep pitching your people. If you want to work in Seattle, you have lots of options here. I think it leads to more choice for people in the workforce is ultimately what happens.
I love the pitching, and that is why, if everybody saw the graphic that we made, it is very much, let's go SF versus Seattle. I think that it's really important to do an apples to apples comparison, because let's be honest, everybody is during today's conversation, I am sure you have had this apples to apples thought in your head, right? Everybody's trying to figure out, the pandemic has really changed a lot of people's priorities. A lot of what people thought was going to be their path in life, their career paths, and it's really flipped so many people on their head, I think. So here's a great question from Lance. Being remote does not absolve an employer from all the federal, state, municipal regulations that come along with having their employees now located across multiple jurisdictions. How are founders and CEOs addressing this, ensuring they're in compliance? Is the thinking that we'll deal with that when a problem is pointed out? In the meantime, out of sight, out of mind. This is a huge problem that has been going on with so many workers that have been moving around. We've spoken with folks in leadership at Google and other places where it is very, very hard to track down where all of their employees are located. And so a lot of them put in deadlines, essentially. A lot of that was January 1st. I believe July 1st is the other big deadline coming up for a lot of companies, where you had to write down specifically to your employer where you're going to be based out of, because obviously you have to be a registered corporation in that state. You have to register in all 50 states. You've got to pay different state taxes, different rules for every single state. And so you can't just simply work remote in Miami Beach and continue being a California resident if the majority of your work is now centralized in Florida, for instance. So that is definitely something that tech companies are looking at. But to speak to the larger level conversation, not just at how companies deal with employees, but how cities deal with employees, mark my words, everybody, this is going to be a battle of 2021, is can you tax remote workers? You think you're going to hear about that in Seattle?
Agreed. Agreed.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think especially with our Jumpstart Seattle tax, which taxes people with $150,000 plus salaries, right? Like there is definitely going to be some issues going on related to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we're having with California right now is there's a number of different business tax proposals happening at a state level, whereas you guys in Washington, you don't have a state tax. And that makes you a little, you look like you're going to say something. That makes you in a little different position than California, right? California also has the only capital gains tax in all of the country as well, right? That's an extra 13-14% if you do have some sort of liquidity event. So California is really just mounting taxes at all levels except for local, because it is not allowed at the state level. That could potentially change too. Whereas at least with you all, you're dealing with more municipal taxes, right?
Yeah. I mean, we don't have a state tax. There have been a number of challenges to that, all of which they generally end up in our state Supreme Court and get struck down because it's written into the Constitution. And I'm simplifying, so if you're a true policy wonk, please don't just take my single words, but go read the actual documents. There are a couple of things going on right now that I think are interesting to note. So we have a proposed billionaire tax. So any of our local billionaires can be assessed based on the amount of assets that they have. And that one's interesting because that's got Dan Price behind it. Dan Price of Gravity Payments, who's very outspoken. He's the CEO that is very outspoken about tax policy, as well as he all of his employees. The bottom level of his employees is $70,000 salary. I think he's very interesting to listen to. So that's kind of making its way through the state legislature as we speak. And then Seattle at one point also tried to implement an income tax. I think it was on, salaries or income over $250,000. And that was probably back in 2016, 2017, somewhere in that neighborhood. That one got struck down. So, there's all these jockeying moves that are happening to see if different municipalities or different policy can get passed. But historically, it's ended in the Supreme Court.
All right. Well, Nick, it's been a joy to chat. It's always great to catch up. What is the number one policy or area that you want to point everybody listening to today to focus on? Where do you think that we need to put the most support?
I mean, from our perspective, I think coming back to what we were talking about earlier and thinking through these work from home policies and how that actually plays out, and whether that's taxation at the municipal level or the sort of cascade of policies that are going to happen around ideally like upzoning in different areas that you may not have needed upzoning before. I think that is just going to send off like a huge wave of really interesting things to be watching. So that's where I'm going to be focused.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for the chat, everybody. You can go get back to work now. Thank you for joining us for the lunch hour, and feel free to tweet and send more questions in for more conversations like this. Who do you want to hear from? What do you want to hear about? All right. See ya, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.